I recognize a member for Coquitlam-Maillardville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I rise today to add my comments and thoughts to the debate on Bill 28, Miscellaneous Statutes Housing Priority Initiatives Amendment Act. And I was listening to my colleagues earlier and people referring to this rare summer sitting, and I have to say, Honourable Speaker, after having been elected in 2013, this is the third summer that I have been here in this House, so I'm not quite sure how rare it is, given that it's only been 3 summers. So it certainly seems like it's just a regular opportunity, and I should be leaving some of my my flip-flops here in the in my place here. So that becomes sort of, you know, what we wear these days here in this legislature. And flip-flops are really good summer wear. So we're here because there are 4 pieces of this particular legislation, Bill 28. But before I want to go into those pieces and about how I understand them and how it's going to affect the people that I represent in Coquitlam-Maillardville, I want to talk about how we got here. Because this affordability crisis is not new. It might be new to members across the way, but it's certainly been one that I've been hearing about in Coquitlam-Maillardville. It's a crisis that could have been managed, that could have been handled, and it could have been addressed before it reached such epic proportions. And it's really disappointing to have a government that is so late to this party, trying to close a barn door after the horse has left is not an easy thing. As the MLA for Coquitlam-Maillardville, I spent a considerable amount of time, Honourable Speaker, talking to people. It's what we do. It's what we all do as MLAs. But we also need to be listening to people, Honourable Speaker. And in 2013, when I was campaigning on the doorstep, I heard lots about hospital wait lists, surgery wait lists. I heard lots about concerns about education and concerns about public schools. And I heard a little bit about the economy. Honourable Speaker, in the last, 8-10 months, all I've been hearing as I listen to people is about affordability. They're not talking about a whole lot of other things. Yes, there's still a bit of conversation about schools, and yes, there's some conversation about hospital wait lists, but the theme everywhere I go, Honourable Speaker, is housing affordability. And I started hearing those rumblings a number of years ago, but I would actually say in the last 10 months, it's been every single conversation. So I think as British Columbians, and well, it's probably more Lower Mainland, people always talk about the weather. That's sort of a regular thing. Well, that's changed too, Honourable Speaker. They're not talking about the weather. They're talking about housing affordability. That's been quite the surprise for me. So if this government had been really listening to British Columbians, really listening to people in Metro Vancouver, really cared to listen to what was going on, I would have hoped that they would have acted sooner. Or perhaps they weren't interested in acting. Not quite sure which part of that equation it was. They weren't listening or they didn't care to act. But life has been getting harder and harder for my constituents, Honourable Speaker. They're noticing increased MSP taxes, increased hydro rates, increased camping fees, and they're having a harder and harder time making ends meet. And when I would talk about affordability in general at the doorstep, when people would talk about it, there were these 4 sort of distinct groups, and housing was always an issue for them, Honourable Speaker. I'm going to tell a couple of stories because I think it's important to understand the way in which this housing affordability crisis is affecting different groups of people. So there are a number of seniors that I've spoken to who have either come to talk to me in my office or I've spoken to them on the doorstep. And what they're saying in the community of Coquitlam-Maillardville is, I have lived in my house for 50 years. I've raised my children here. It's a single-family house. It's worth a whole lot of money. They know the value of their house is going up. It will probably be a tear down because they have not been able to keep up with the increased costs of maintenance of their house. They are on a fixed limited income. They are those people who are property rich and cash poor. They are finding that groceries are becoming more expensive. Hydro, certainly those rates are going up. Paying for their prescriptions is becoming a challenge. And even if they wanted to downsize, even if they wanted to leave the community, because in certain neighborhoods they are not building higher density, they have commented that there's nowhere for them to go. If they want to cash out of the market, they want to sell their house, they want to put it on the market, sort of increase the stock so that a family could move in, they're saying there's no rental accommodation for them anywhere. They no longer want to be a homeowner, right? At the beginning of your life, you rent until you have enough to buy, and then you go back to being a renter again towards the end of your life, Honorable Speaker. I think that's sort of the way it's supposed to go. There's no place for them to rent. And so my dad actually found this. He's been a homeowner since 1960, and moved from Montreal, family moved to Richmond, and now my dad lives in Vancouver. And he owned a townhouse. And he'll be 77 this year, and he's decided, my mom died a couple of years ago, and he decided that he didn't want to be a homeowner anymore. He wanted to be able to just sort of lock the keys and either travel or just not worry about stuff, and certainly not be hit with a bill that required, if you're living in a strata, that required a special levy because you needed a new roof or new balconies. He wanted to have a little bit more control because he is now retired and he has a fixed income. Now, it's a decent income. He has saved appropriately. He's made some really good decisions, and he's certainly had opportunities in his life. And he wanted to rent, and he didn't want to rent somebody's condo because, of course, they could sell it at any time. He wanted to rent in a rental building where he could live out his remaining years, and I pray that he has many remaining years, however long they may be, but he wants to be a renter. In his community, he lives in Vancouver, Langara. He wanted to stay there because his life is there, his friends are there. This is where he does his activities, his shopping, his banking. There were 3 places for him to look at, Honorable Speaker. This is just a few months ago. This is just April. 3. 2 were in very old 3-story walk-ups with the laundry in the basement, and he thought, I'm not going to be doing that. And 1 made sense. And it was expensive, but my dad can manage. But there was one appropriate for an older adult, healthy adult, to live in. 1. So there was nothing, there was no option. So I have those seniors in my community too, Honorable Speaker. They can't find the kind of housing that they need. And there has been an absence of anything from this government to try to make that different, to try to make sure that the housing stock that does exist circulates in the right ways. How do we make it easier for seniors to give up their 3,000 square foot home that they no longer need? They're ready to move to something smaller and more manageable, but there's nothing to move to. Well, there has been an absence of influence, an absence of conversation from this government on that. They've been here for 15 years, and the conversation has been nothing, nada, not there, not present. Now, in my own community, specifically when we talk about the rental stock, it's just not keeping pace with growth. Purpose-built market rental is also nearly non-existent, and the affordable rental stock, those are the older kinds of housing, you know, the stuff that was built 50 years ago, those older 4-story walk-ups, they tended to have larger bedrooms, and more bedrooms in each unit. Those are the units that the Syrian refugees are desperately looking for in all of our communities, certainly throughout Metro Vancouver. Well, those, Honorable Speaker, those are being torn down at a record rate in my community and being replaced by market condos. So we are seeing this incredible pressure. And the member from Coquitlam talked about immigrants. It was very interesting. I was listening to his speech. He talked about immigrants coming over and starting off by renting. I mean, I remember immigrating from Montreal as a 14-year-old, and my parents not knowing which community to purchase in, and they rented in Richmond. And it was like, I'd always lived in a house that they owned, and we were renters, and that was sort of interesting. It was an interesting experience. But, Honorable Speaker, there is no place to rent. It makes sense. I get it. I understand what the member from Coquitlam was saying. You start off renting because you're not sure where you want to live, you're not sure what your income is going to be. You have to get life set up for yourself before you figure out exactly where life will be for you and your family. But there's no place to rent. Vancouver has a vacancy rate of 0.6%. In other words, there's no place to rent. And there's nothing here in this legislation that addresses that, nothing. So these seniors that I talked about, affordability is an issue for them in my community, and I hear that from them regularly. Now, I also hear from another group, Honorable Speaker, and these are families with grown children. They would be families like mine, perhaps families like the Speaker's. Our children are adult children. So the house for many of these families, their house is paid for because their children have now grown. They've had it for, let's say, a 25-year mortgage. But their children won't leave. And there was one house that I came across, there were 6 cars in the driveway. 6 cars, Honorable Speaker. Partly because there's no transit, but that's a whole other conversation that I would love to have at another time. But also because there was no place for their adult children to go. They would tell me their story. They were saying, I don't know what to do. I have 4 children. They're between the ages of 28 and 22. They're finished school. They've got jobs. There's no place for them to go. There's no place to rent. They certainly can't afford to get into the market. And I've got 4 of them. How am I going to help 4 of them? So they're talking about, do I remortgage my house to give each child a little bit of money? But it's not going to be enough money to get any of them into the market. This is untenable, Honorable Speaker. They are saying our kids can't get launched. They can't move forward. They can't have a life of their own. And they're saying, and I want them out because it's better for them. And then there's the families that I talk to with young children, Honorable Speaker. These are families that are completely stretched. They not only have significant mortgage payments, but the school fees that have been offloaded to parents keep growing. They talk about the toll on the Port Mann Bridge that now adds to their annual costs. They talk about the increased hydro rates, the increased ICBC rates, and the MSP taxes. And even taking their family camping, they see an increase. These are the families, Honorable Speaker, that I worry about a lot because they can't get ahead. And childcare, that's a mortgage payment as well. So they are really stuck. In fact, there's one family that is dying to come and visit us here in the legislature. And when I said we have this rare summer session that is becoming a regular, I said, well, why don't, the kids aren't in school, and she's a teacher, and he works for a municipal government. And I said, well, why don't you come and visit me in the legislature? Because they're dying for a tour. They're just dying to come. And her note to me was, well, we'll take a look. And she said, you know what? The ferry's just too expensive. We can't afford it. She's a teacher. He's working for municipal government. They make a good wage. They live in a townhouse in the community, and they can't afford a little trip in the middle of summer to come to the legislature. How is that, Honorable Speaker? How did we get here? So the fourth group, Honorable Speaker, is the young renters that I've come across in my constituency. You see, in Coquitlam-Maillardville, there's a handful of 3- or 4-story walk-ups, and there's one high-rise. It's about 10 stories. And so any sort of affordable rental stock has really been basement suites and houses in mostly in Maillardville. It's older stock and on large properties. And so we tend to have a lot of young renters that live there. And these are also heartbreaking stories. Now, the renters that I think about all the renters that I've come across, and there's one that stands out because his story was wrong in so many different levels. It just didn't fit. So this was a young man who was hired by a crown corporation, because he has a particular specialty. And what caught my attention when I walked up to knock on his door was the car in the front had a Quebec license plate, Je me souviens, And I thought, well, you know, he's in Maillardville. This is great. Someone from Quebec is in Maillardville. He probably wanted to come to Maillardville, right? Thinking French speaking. Maybe it's a little piece of home. And so I asked him about his decision to make Maillardville his home, because that's what caught my attention. And he told me that he was recruited to come across the country because of this particular specialty. And he picked Maillardville because he thought maybe he could actually afford to buy here, because everywhere he looked, he thought maybe Richmond, maybe Vancouver, maybe Burnaby, he couldn't afford, and he kept going further east. And he got to Maillardville and he thought, I am making a chunk of change. I was headhunted, right? So he could get a salary that was needed by this Crown Corporation. And he said, I can't afford to buy here. I can't afford to live in Coquitlam. He has a job. He's a single person. He's not paying childcare. He has work. And he is renting a basement suite in Maillardville. And he commented on how ridiculous the housing prices were, and frustrated that even with a good job working for a Crown Corporation, he couldn't afford to purchase anything. And there was almost nothing available to rent. So, and this is someone I talked to 6 months ago, Honorable Speaker. So, what was the government's response when we think back just a few short weeks ago even? But let's go further back. What's the government's response been to the fact that people have not been able to afford to live in the Lower Mainland for years? Well, in May 2015, when the Minister of Housing was commenting on the fact that we were saying, and others were saying, that housing prices were really getting too high, that it was really a problem. He was saying, no, housing prices were reasonable. And it, quote, if you look at the mean cost of housing across British Columbia, or the mean of the Lower Mainland, and compare it to other major cities worldwide, the reason it's attractive internationally is because it's actually pretty reasonable compared to other cities like London, Singapore, Tokyo, those cities. Well, here was someone who was coming from Montreal. I think that's an international city. I came from Montreal. It's a pretty happening place. It's not Vancouver. That's why I'm still here. But he couldn't afford a place. He couldn't afford to live here. And the Minister of Housing said, it's fine. Well, what did the Premier have to say? Because she has her own thoughts. Well, in June of 2015, she said, and I quote, there are lots of great places to live. Fort St. John is booming, and it won't be long before you see we need lots of new people up in Kitimat and Prince Rupert. She's probably alluding to LNG that has yet to materialize, Honourable Speaker. And she points out, of course, that the views are amazing. I bet she regrets saying that, because these are words that are going to continue to haunt her. Because she didn't appreciate what was going on for people in the Lower Mainland. Oh, just leave the Lower Mainland. Just go somewhere else. Somewhere else where there's no jobs. Somewhere else where you're not being headhunted with a good wage. So what, this man from Quebec should live in Terrace and commute to his job? What a ridiculous thing to say, Honourable Speaker, and how we're disrespectful of the people who are trying to make ends meet. Well, let's move forward. February 2016, that was just a few months ago. The member from Chilliwack Hope said, no one has a God-given right to live in a particular place. Wow. Strong words. No one has a God-given right to live in a particular place. I don't know what he was thinking. People are working hard. They're getting priced out of a market where their supports are, where their jobs are, and that's the best he can do? Or what about the Minister of Finance? What does he have to say? 6 weeks ago, I heard the member from Revelstoke commenting that it's just 6 weeks ago. Geez. 6 weeks ago, he was saying that there's nothing wrong with the housing market. I quote, we're actually proud. actually proud of the fact that we have a jurisdiction in British Columbia that people want to come to, that they feel they can succeed in, that they want to invest in. So he's proud of the fact that foreign offshore money, laundered money perhaps, is coming into the housing market and distorting it. How lovely is that? British Columbians should be proud of that. Or what about this one? Tell us about the vacancy tax. Tell us about the economic wall he and his colleagues would build if, God forbid, they were ever given the chance to govern British Columbia. So now we have, 6 weeks later, we have a tune that's sort of changed, Honorable Speaker. And then we have the housing minister once again not paying attention to what British Columbians are saying, certainly not paying attention to what I'm hearing on the doorstep in Coquitlam-Maillardville. His response 6 weeks ago is to tell people to stop whining about housing. And he said on CKNW, I guess some people just have to get up and whine every day. I don't know. You just have to look at the glass as half full, not half empty, right? How condescending. How condescending to that fellow from Quebec who's trying to start a new life for himself in Coquitlam-Maillardville, to the parents that I talk to who are trying to make ends meet with increased affordability costs, around increased hydro rates, increased ICB, increased MSP taxes, school fees that are loaded down on them, trying to make their mortgage payments and having to pay a toll that they didn't used to have to pay when one of them goes to their job at the hospital in Surrey because there's no transit. Honorable Speaker, they should stop whining. The senior who says, I can't keep up, my pension isn't keeping up, my housing situation is changing, I can't get enough home support, I have to pay for medication or I have to pay for additional home support. I want to sell my house, but there's nowhere for me to go to because there's no place for me to move to, because there's no rental accommodation. They should stop whining. I hope everyone on that side of the House is embarrassed by those comments. It was horrifying to listen to it then, and it continues to be horrifying now. To finally see that it's come to the government's attention that this is a crisis is quite interesting, Honorable Speaker, because I'm always interested in sort of like, what's the motivation? Because 6 weeks ago really is not long time ago. Just 6 weeks ago. 45, 46 days ago. So why now? And as a therapist, I always say that when people talk about, well, I've been depressed for years or my marriage has been bad for years, I always say, so why now? So why are you asking for help now? Like, what's the trigger? And so I think about that. I think about, why is government doing this now? If we've been talking on this side of the House, if we've been coming into this House and saying, this is an issue, this is a problem, if I've been hearing about housing affordability in my office, I am sure that every single Metro Vancouver MLA across the way has been hearing the same thing. So why now? Well, Honorable Speaker, the government's paying attention now because there's an election coming. And I believe that polling has perhaps suggested that this is an issue for British Columbians. I am sure that they spent a pretty penny on that polling. I'm sure it costs them money. Like, they have lots of it, so I'm not really worried about their, the Liberals' checkbook. But I am sure they spent a lot of money on that polling when all they had to do was listen to British Columbians. You didn't have to do polling. I could have told you. I think we did tell them. I think we told you. I think we said to the government, this is an issue. But they didn't want to, they don't trust us, and they don't trust constituents. They actually had to do the polling. Let's get the data on this. I could go out on a Saturday afternoon and knock on a couple of dozen doors and knew right away that that's the issue. It doesn't take rocket science, it doesn't take polling. And it shouldn't take an election to finally wake up to this issue. So what does this tell us? This tells us that this government, I think, this government doesn't really care about the housing affordability crisis. It's time to come clean. They just care about getting reelected. They have less than 300 days, and now they have the polling data that tells them that they ought to do something so that it looks like they care. Looks like they care. So I even noticed the language of the government tweets as when they changed, when we were called back to this rare summer session, the language changed. And it was very, very interesting. It was really subtle. And it said something like, and it was the Premier's Twitter account, and it said something like, continuing to address, we're having a rare summer session so we can continue to address the housing affordability crisis. Continue to address. Continue? Continue what? You haven't even started. But it's the messaging, Honorable Speaker. It's about we have to start making it look like we're actually doing something. It's that meme. It's like capturing the message that we are on it. We are on this housing thing. Well, Honorable Speaker, I guess that's what the Premier and her communications team want her to do and want everyone in this House, this government side to do. They want to make it start looking like they're actually doing something. I think that's the motivation behind this legislation. So, what does the proposed legislation actually do? Well, there are 4 things in this legislation. There's the addressing the foreign nationals, charging them a property transfer tax of 15% on residential property purchases in Metro Vancouver. So foreign nationals, that means people who come from away, if I can use a Newfoundland term, they come from away. They are going to have to pay this tax should they purchase a home. So we're already, and I heard this example used, and I thought it was a good example. It's that professor who comes for 3 years, or it's somebody is headhunted, like this fellow who came from Quebec. Well, what if he came from New York to work for a Crown Corporation? What if he didn't come from Quebec? What if he came from the US, or he came from China, or if he came from India? We're recruiting him, and now we're going to charge a surtax. So I thought that was interesting, and it's not about the money, Honorable Speaker, it's about the citizenship. I thought that was just really interesting. Why wouldn't it be about the money? The money's the issue. Where's the money coming from? Not where the people coming from. And then there's this other part that I find is really interesting, and I had a chuckle when I read this part, that the new tax will take effect August 2nd. So 6 weeks ago it wasn't an issue. In fact, it was just whining from a bunch of people. Now we're going to get her done, and Tuesday it comes into effect. Tuesday, Honorable Speaker. And the idea that it's going to move that quickly suggests to me that they need to make it look like it's happening really fast. Really fast. And the only other person I think of that talks about things happening really fast is Donald Trump, because he talked about that in his speech, really fast. So, Honorable Speaker, I'm aware of time passing, and there's 3 other pieces that I'd like to just quickly make mention of. There's the creation of the new Housing Priorities Initiative Fund, and that's for Provincial Housing and Rental Program, and they're seeding it with $75 million. Well, Honorable Speaker, that's going to build 75 units of housing. Not quite sure how that's going to make a difference, Honorable Speaker. Then there's fixing the problem that they created, which is ending the self-regulation of the real estate industry. Well, let's be really clear. This problem only exists because this government chose to deregulate, and this is what happens. And it's time to clean up their mess. Now, the 4th thing that this legislation is going to be doing is make amendments to the Vancouver Charter to provide Vancouver, and only Vancouver, the authority to implement a vacancy tax. And so this is one I find incredibly interesting, Honorable Speaker, because when I heard the minister, finance minister say, well, the reason he's offering this to Vancouver is because they asked. Because they asked. I thought, well, Vancouver has asked also for the enabling legislation that would allow them to address the election finance reform for Vancouver, because they have a problem there with that. But the message they got back was, no, we govern the entire province. We're not going to give you special opportunity. But here, in this case, it's, well, because you asked. And then, because it's just enabling legislation, other communities are saying, well, what if we want to do that? Maybe that might be an opportunity for us. They are told no. So, Honourable Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this bill.
Thank you, Member.